From community to crowd, to congregation to committed, to core, to commission. How do you bring people in? How do you build them up? How do you teach them out? Equip them for their ministries, and then send them out on their life mission. And we're going to start with targeting your community for evangelism. Did everybody get this outline? All right. I mentioned in an earlier session that last weekend we baptized 792 people, and that put us at about 45,700 people baptized at Saddleback Church in the history of the church. How have we done that? Well, I'd like to share with you some things we've learned about evangelism. Now, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, Jesus says, he called out, "Come along with me, and I will show you how to fish for the souls of men." Circle the word how. I will show you how to fish for the souls of men. Now, Jesus calls his disciples by saying, I'm going to teach you how to fish. I don't think Jesus chose the analogy of fishing by accident. Certainly the disciples were fishermen. But I think he intentionally chose the analogy of fishing for a couple reasons to apply to evangelism. First, fishing is universal. You can fish on any continent. And second, there are numerous parallels that if you dig down deep between fishing and between evangelism, that we have a lot to learn. Now, the reality is, particularly in America, most churches that get big actually get big by attracting other Christians from other churches. That's not really growing, friends. That's swelling. Jesus called us to be fishers of men, not to swap fish from aquarium to aquarium. That's not legitimate growth. And anytime you see a church that grows really, really fast, now I'm not talking about over decades, I'm talking about really fast in a year or two. Well, if you look beneath the surface, it's usually kind of a hot acting town, and Christians are flooding to that church and leaving other churches. That's not the Great Commission, friends. The thing that I'm most satisfied with at Saddleback Church is that about 78% of the members of this church came to Christ here. They're one of those 46,000 people baptized. This is not a church that grew at the expense of other churches. In fact, we've helped other churches. It's our goal. Many years we had so many musicians in this church, we couldn't even use them on the weekend, so we actually farmed them out to about a half dozen other churches in the area who just needed them. And Saddleback was providing the worship teams for a lot of other churches. We are not in competition with any other church, and neither are you. When I started Saddleback, one of the first things I did is I went and visited all the existing churches just to see who was doing a good job, what I could learn from them. And while I was there, I counted the number of chairs in all the churches in South Orange County, and I added it up, and I discovered that if we filled every church in South Orange County 3 times on the weekend, we would still be reaching less than 5% of the population. And I bet that's true in your town too. It's like 2 ants arguing over who's going to eat the elephant. The fact is, this next weekend, most of Americans, and in the other countries certainly that's true too, will not be at my church, they won't be at your church, they won't be at any church, they're out wrecking creation in recreation. And the competition for your church is not other churches. It's the world, the flesh, and the devil. We're on the same team. We want every church to grow. I've helped at least 12 other denominations plant a church in the Saddleback Valley since I've been here. I'm not worried about that. It's nonsense to think that one church could reach everybody. I have a family of 2 parents, and we had 3 kids, and 5 of us like 5 different radio stations. If I can't get my family to agree on music, why in the world would I think I could get everybody in the world to agree on a worship style? It's nonsense. Have you figured this out, that God loves variety? I mean, when God made insects, did you know that he made over 8,000 different kinds of beetles? Really, 8,000. Do we need 8,000 kinds of beetles? You would have thought maybe 400 or 500 would be enough. No, God overdoses on variety. And not only does he make 8,000 kinds of varieties of beetles, he names them all. John, Paul, Ringo, George, and who knows what the other ones are named. But he knows them all. And if you look around your table, nobody looks alike. Man makes clones. God never makes a clone. No snowflakes are alike. No 2 human beings are alike. No 2 churches are alike. That's intentional. God doesn't want you to be Saddleback Church. He doesn't want us to be you. He wants you to be you. But there are things that we can learn from each other, and there are principles, and there are purposes, and there are methods that we can learn and we can share with each other. Well, we're all on the same team. And so we rejoice in people. When people leave Saddleback Church, you know, in the early years, when I was young, I would take that personally. It was almost like a divorce. Why are they leaving our church? Have they rejected me? Have they rejected our church? I just realized now, everybody needs change in their life. You know, 36 years later, I wouldn't probably become a Saddleback if I weren't the pastor. But I have to show up. It's okay for people to change and to move around. That's okay. And here's the thing. If you will hold everything you've got with an open hand, God will give you more than you could possibly handle. It's like giving blood. When you give blood, you don't lose, you win. God replaces that. And so when we have staff go to other churches, I don't spend a night, lose a night's sleep or anything like that, because we're all on the same team. And it takes all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people. And as I said, if you're getting the job done, I like the way you're doing it. So when we talk about evangelism, I'm not talking about transfer growth from other churches. That's not legitimate growth. We want to win people to Christ and then build them up into maturity. So what is the secret of winning a lot of people to Christ? Real simple. Follow the example of Jesus in fishing for men. And that's what we're going to look at in this session. Every session I'm going to keep taking you back to how did Jesus do it? How did Jesus do it? How did Jesus do it? Because, as I said, methods are many, principles are few. Methods change often, principles never do. If Jesus did it, it's transcultural. It'll work in any age and stage of church, and it'll work in any culture. Now, the Bible tells us that Jesus not only gave us the message to share, but he also said, the Bible says, the Father told me what to say and how to say it. Oftentimes we miss that second part. Jesus said, the Father told me what to say and how to say it. He had a method, he had a style of communicating. And he not only in evangelism gave us the message of evangelism, he gives us the method of evangelism. So what we're going to do in this session is look at 6 principles of evangelism. They're all found in Matthew 10 and Luke chapter 10. It's Jesus' strategy of fishing for men. Now later we're going to come back when we talk about mission and talk about these chapters in detail. Jesus 3 times sent out teams to do church planting, to do evangelism, to do ministry. He sent out the 12, he sent out the 70, he sent out the 120. He constantly was sending out, he always sent out the pairs. And in those mission trips, Luke 10 and Matthew 10, and I think Mark 9's got a few there, there are about 17 things that Jesus says to do when he sent the teams out on evangelism. To my knowledge, there's not a single mission board on planet Earth that's following those 17 things. Why not? Why not? If we actually follow what Jesus tells us to do, like don't take a purse, don't take a staff, what do all those things mean? Eat what is set before you. Find the man of peace. If we do it Jesus' way, we're going to get Jesus' results. So let's look just first, not at mission, but at evangelism, and how Jesus trained disciples to be fishers of men. And here are the 6 principles we find in his life. Number 1, know what you're fishing for. Know what you're fishing for. You have to clearly identify who you're trying to reach. Now, if you ask the typical church member, or even pastor, who are you trying to reach, what are they going to say? Everybody. Yeah, everybody. You know, who's your church? Well, we're trying to reach everybody. Well, the fact is, no church can reach everybody. The moment you determine a worship style, you're telling me who you're going to reach and who you're not going to reach. The moment you choose music, you're telling me who you're going to reach and what you're not going to reach. The moment you choose the style of preaching, you're telling me who you're going to reach and who you're not going to reach. You're kidding yourself. You got to specialize. What if there was a radio that said, we're going to try to appeal to everybody? In 1 minute they play a classical number, and the next minute they play a rock and roll number, and the next minute an easy listening, the next minute a Bill Gaither hymn, and the next minute a hip-hop number, and the next minute jazz, and the next minute polka. What kind of audience would they have? None! You just make everybody mad. And that's what happens when you try to blend your music or try to reach everybody. You can't chase 2 rabbits at the same time. So when we talk about targeting your community for ministry, we're talking about actually being more focused. Now, you got to know what you're fishing for. The kind of fish that you want to catch are going to determine every single part of your strategy. Your bait, your equipment, your timing, your hooks, even the lakes you fish in. Do bass require a different kind of fishing technique than catfish? Oh yeah, exactly, they sure do. And you know, bottom feeders, you don't go use a fly caster, and depending on the fish you're trying to catch, will depend on the strategy that you use. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, who are you trying to reach in your church? Because if you just have this vague picture out there. Now, this is what I call targeting. And it helps to know what you're fishing for. Are you fishing for teenagers? Are you fishing for couples? Are you fishing for single adults? Are you fishing for senior adults? Your target is going to determine a lot of your approach. You got to know what you're fishing for. And this idea of targeting, it's not something I made up. It's all through the Bible, as particularly in the New Testament. Let me just show you a couple examples. We know, for instance, that Jesus had a specific evangelistic target. Jesus says himself in Matthew 15, verse 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. I didn't say that. Jesus said it. Does he not love everybody in the whole world? Of course he loves everybody in the whole world. But he is evangelistically targeting, he says, the lost sheep of Israel. He says God the Father sent him to a specific evangelistic target. That's Matthew 15, 24. Now the same thing is true of Peter and Paul. They both had a specific evangelistic target. And we see here in Galatians 2:7, Paul says, I was entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been given the task of preaching the gospel to the Jews. What do you call it? Targeting. That's evangelistic targeting. They have a clear target of who they're trying to reach. Even the disciples were given a specific target. And when Jesus sends them out in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, Jesus gave these very specific instructions. Don't go, do not go among the Gentiles, or don't enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Have you ever seen that verse? That's called evangelistic targeting. Now, why is he doing this? Why is Paul targeting, Peter targeting, Jesus targeting, and why are the disciples targeting specifically who they're trying to reach? Not to be exclusive, but to be effective. Because you can't reach everybody, and I can't reach everybody. There's certain kinds of people I can reach well, there's certain kinds of people you can reach well, there's certain kinds of people your church can reach well. But you got to know who you're going after. Have you ever thought about this? Why are there 4 Gospels? I mean, they tell pretty much the same stories. In fact, some stories like feeding of 5,000, it's in all 4 Gospels. Do we really need to read it 4 times? Why did God give us 4 Gospels? Same stories, different targets. Matthew wrote, he's targeting for the Jewish mind. Mark wrote for Gentiles. Same message, different targets. We have the Gospels because of targeting in evangelism. They were written for different groups. Now the problem is a lot of churches are kind of like Charlie Brown, the old cartoon, where Charlie Brown would shoot an arrow at a fence, and then once it's stuck, he'd go over and he'd draw a bullseye around it. And Lucy asked him, said, well, why are you doing that? He says, because that way I never miss. And a lot of times that's true of our churches. The people we reach, we go, well, that was our target. and there wasn't any forethought or any strategy to it. But if you get more focused, you're going to get more effective. So how do you do that? How do you define your evangelistic target? Well, let me give you some questions to ask. Write these down. Number 1, first question to ask about your community is this, is how many people live in our area? That's a targeting question. How many people live in our area? And what you're doing here is you're defining your geographic target. And what I would suggest you do is you get out a map of your area and you put a dot where your church is, and then you put some circles of like 1 mile and 3 miles and 5 miles around that circle. You're defining your target geographically. You're saying, who are we most likely to reach? The people who live here closest to us. Not 100 miles away, but right here in this particular area. So on your map, you draw 3 circles representing 1, 3, 5 miles around your church. Figure out the number of people who live within the average trip time of getting to your church. And then you figure maybe 50% of that population is unchurched. That's very, very conservative. A lot of your areas would be 90% unchurched, but in some places in the South it wouldn't be that much. But that number is your fishing pond. That's where you're going to go fishing. You're defining yourself geographically. Who's in our driving distance? How many people are there? And you ask that question, defining your target geographically. Number 2, second question to ask: what kind of people live in this area, in these circles? Now you're defining your target demographically. What kind of people? First you found out how many fish are in your pond. And now you're going to find out, are they catfish? Are they tuna? Are they crappie? Are they bluegill? Are they salmon? Are they sturgeon? What kind of fish do you have in your pond? And I've written there on your outline some things you want to find down there. Age breakdown. How many in each age group? Marital breakdown. How many of them are singles? How many of them are married? Income breakdown. What's the typical earn? What do they earn there? Occupational breakdown. Where do they work? In other words, are they blue collar? Are they white collar? Now, where do you get that kind of information? Well, I've listed some sources. There's the government census. You can go to the library. You can go to your county, city planning department. Newspapers will often have this information because they're getting it from advertisers. Chambers of commerce might have this kind of information. Builders, realtors, utilities. Here's the point. I want you to become an expert on your community. If you're a pastor or you're a church staff member, you should know more about your community than anybody else, because it has life and death consequences. And pastors should know more than anybody else. Before I even moved to the Saddleback Valley, I did all kinds of research, extensive research. In fact, I spent 3 months. I was finishing up seminary in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I remember going over to TCU Library, because that's I wasn't going to school there, but they had a library that had all the census statistics. And I went down into the basement, and I remember looking at the statistics on a number of different areas on the West Coast when I was trying to summarize and decide where to go. And I finally narrowed it down to 4 areas on the West Coast: Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego, Orange County. And I spent about 3 months studying this kind of information on those 4 areas: Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego, and Orange County. And I'll never forget, it was a holy moment for me at 24 years of age. I was sitting in the bowels of the basement of Texas Christian University Library, looking at the census statistic. There was a single light bulb coming down on a wire, and I'm in this room by myself, dusty, musty place. And I discovered that the Saddleback Valley was the fastest, this area here, it's about 5 different cities, was the fastest growing area in Orange County. And that Orange County was the fastest growing county in the entire United States between 1970 and 1980. Now that's not true anymore, but that's what it was then. So this was the fastest growing area in the fastest growing county in the United States. And that caught my attention. And I remember it was like God spoke directly to me, and tears came down my face, and God said, "You're going to spend the rest of your life right there." And I can still get chills thinking about that. It was just studying hard, cold facts. I thought wherever people are moving in, they're going to need new churches. And God said, that's where you're going to spend your life. I told Lord, I'll go anywhere in the world. I was willing to go to China, as I told you. I'll go anywhere in the world if you'll give me the privilege of spending my entire life in just one location. One of the things I value is stability. And I've now seen 3, maybe 4 generations in this church. I've seen little kids be born in the church, grow up, go through the cute little toddler stage, and then the awkward grade school stage, and then the heartbreaking junior high school stage, and then go to high school and get their heart broken even more, and then they go off to college, come back, and get married. And I value that. I now have people on my staff who were born in this church. I was there when they were born, and they now serve as a minister, as a director, as a pastor of this church. And I value it. When you have integrity, it gets better every year. If you don't have integrity, it gets worse. I'll tell you that. But if you're honest with people, and you're genuine with people, it actually gets better every year. I know far more about Orange County than any politician ever will, because I've been talking to the members of this county for 36 years. I know their ins and outs and their ups and downs. I know their values. And that comes from experience. But when you start out, you just have to go get it. And so I went and I studied all these statistics, and I went to the county offices, and I got the government census, and I went to the planning department, and I did all these things just to become knowing not only who lives in the area, but what kind of people live in the area. I actually wrote, before I even moved to Southern California, I wrote to every pastor in this area. Asked them a series of questions. He said, "I'm thinking about coming to start a church. What do you think?" I'm just asking their advice. And I kept a notebook, and I wrote it all down. I memorized names of streets in this community before I even moved here. I wanted to know that much about. The Bible says, "Know the condition of your flock," in the book of Proverbs, but I say also know the condition of your community. What kind of people live in our area? You need to become an expert on that. Number 3, here's a third question to ask. What are their values and their fears and their interests? Their values and their interests and their fears. What are their values and interests and fears? Now what you're doing is you're defining your target culturally. What's the culture of your community? What's the mindset? What are the values? What's the lifestyle? Would you say that a lifestyle, somebody who lives in LA would be different than somebody who lives in Iowa? Probably. In fact, somebody who lives in LA, his lifestyle or her lifestyle might be different from somebody a block away. There are that many changes. One of the reasons why churches don't reach people is what I call people blindness. They don't see how people are unique. They don't see how people are individual. They're not sensitive to social or cultural differences. Let's just take race. Are all white people alike? Of course not. Are all Hispanics alike? No. Are all African Americans alike? Of course not. Are all Asians alike? Of course not. There are many shades and variations of every culture, every race, every And when you treat everybody like they're the same, with the same values, the same interests, the same urges, you're just not going to be as effective evangelistically. Now, where do you get the information on the culture of your community? You can get the demographic stuff from the government. Where do you get the stuff on your culture? Well, you can pay for it. I would advise that. There are research companies that you can pay that will tell you all the culture of your community. They've mapped everything, every little town and hamlet in America. They'll tell you what kind of people are in your area, what they value, what they don't value. They know this. Advertisers pay big bucks for this. You can hire a research company to do that. But the best source, write this down, is a personal community survey that you do. You actually just go door to door and location, and talk to people. You need to walk your community. You need to just walk among the neighborhoods. You need to go door to door. You need to talk with people in barbershops and grocery stores and at the theater and in stores and take a personal community survey. Well, I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But if you get it yourself, you'll get a whole lot. I did this before I started Saddleback Church. I spent 12 weeks walking door to door in this area. I wasn't trying to witness to anybody. I wasn't trying to convert them. I was just trying to get an opinion poll. And it really gave me a mindset. Number four. Fourth question to ask in targeting your community is to ask, what do they already know about the gospel? What do they already know about the gospel? And this is where you're determining or defining your target spiritually. Because this is very vital. You got to determine their background. Now, in America, probably 80% or more have some kind of religious background. Even the, quote, nuns, who claim to have no affiliation, have some kind of religious background. If you get the Glen Mary maps, it'll show you that, for instance, the East Coast and the West Coast are primarily dominated. The number one religious background on the West Coast and the East Coast is Catholic. It's Catholic. If you're across the South, the number one background across the South is Baptist. If you go in the Midwest, the primary there is Methodist. If you go into the northern parts of Minnesota and the Dakotas, the primary religious background there is Lutheran. So depending on what part of your country, of course you go to Utah, the primary background is what? Mormon. And so, do you know what is the primary religious background of the people in your area? Here in the West Coast, my number one prospect are former Catholic. Why? Catholics founded this state. It was founded by Father Serra. They started the original missions when the Mexican missionaries, actually Spanish missionaries, came in from Mexico and founded this state. So, great evangelistic prospects are out there. You just got to know, what do they already know about the gospel? Do they know anything? Oftentimes I'll hear a pastor tell me, I said, well, tell me about your church. I said, well, our church is designed to reach the unchurched. And I say, great. What kind? What kind of unchurched? Are all unchurched people alike? No. It's like saying, are all Americans alike? There are 1,000 different varieties of unchurched people. There are 1,000 varieties of unchurched believers. When you say we're trying to reach unchurched, what are you talking about? Unchurched hipsters in Seattle? Unchurched farmers in Bakersfield? Unchurched migrants in the Central Valley? Unchurched retired military in San Diego? The term unchurched is a misnomer. It's like saying we're trying to reach everybody. The lost is not a clear enough term. There are a lot of ways to be lost. And there are a lot of ways to be culturally lost too. The point is this, write this down. All unbelievers are not alike. They're not alike. And so that's why, by the way, there's no single way to build an outreach to them. You've got to use different kinds of outreach for different kinds of people. Now, once you've collected all this information on your area, and you've asked these questions, then what you want to do is summarize it in a target, a personalize your target. In other words, what I'm saying is develop a profile of who do we typically try to reach? Who could we reach? The typical non-Christian, the typical resident person in your life and in your community. Now, for years, we actually had a picture of a guy, and we called this couple the typical Southern Saddleback Valley resident, Saddleback Sam and Samantha. His wife, Sam and Samantha. And when I used to teach us in the 90s and 2000s, people started doing Fresno Fred and Atlanta Al and Dallas Debbie and whatever. It was a typical Saddleback Valley resident of the 1980s. I'm not even going to show you our original target because it's changed so much because the county has changed in 3.5 decades. We now have, in this county of 3 million people, 1 million people who habla Espanol. 1 out of every 3 people speak Spanish in Orange County. And we have become a very, very polyglot, very diverse church. But as our county changed and as our culture changed, so did our church. And we actually did it intentionally. In fact, we emphasize diversity in this church. In fact, it's a value to us. I'm not going to have time to go into our Saddleback values, but each letter in our name, S-A-D-D-L-E-B-A-C-K, represents one of the 10 values of our church, not a purpose, a value. For instance, the S, I'll just give you the first 2. S stands for Second Chance Place of Grace. That's a value to us. We're a place for people to start over. If you've messed up, if you don't have it all together, this is the church for you. We really emphasize grace and this place to get a fresh start, a new beginning, second chance place of grace. It's a value in Saddleback Church. But the A in Saddleback is all nation congregation. That's a value of our church. We are intentionally multi-ethnic, multinational, we are multiracial, we are multi-generational. We, in this church, have every culture, we have every language, we have every age group, we have economic status, and that is intentional. We call ourselves an all-nation congregation. Why? Because Jesus said, my house should be called the house of prayer for all nations. So, we say we want our church to look like heaven's going to look. When you get to heaven, most people are not going to look like you. God loves variety. God loves diversity. And so, now, at Saddleback Church, this congregation speaks 67 languages. 67. And if you came to the 11 o'clock service here on Sunday, you would see the United Nations. And I don't think, at that service, I don't think we would have a majority of anything. We've got blacks and whites and Hispanics and Asians and Middle Easterners, and this last weekend, I baptized 12 Muslims from the Middle East. And on Sunday's baptism. I baptized 2 autistic young preteen boys, which I cried through those. We baptized a quadriplegic man who 4 men brought him in the wheelchair into the baptism pool. And we put him down, and he couldn't speak. And when he came out, he was so overwhelmed with joy and he couldn't speak. He just looked at me as his pastor with his thumbs up. That's all he could do. Okay. We had people who were watching online who got in their car and came to be baptized. Who were watching the service. But it's all nation congregation. As I was baptizing every kind of Asian, and Middle Eastern, and African, and Asian, and Russian, and Latin American. And that's intentional. And so our focus, the bigger we got, became much more and more diverse. When we started Saddleback, though, it wasn't that way. Because Saddleback and this area was a pretty homogeneous area. And when I started the church in 1980, everybody pretty much looked like me. They were young and white and drop dead sexy. I just thought I might pass that one by you, but you didn't buy it. But God loves variety. And so today, we are an all-nation congregation. And in LA and in Orange County, I happen to know, we speak in LA, well, we speak 67 languages in this church. Orange and LA County speak 196 languages. And so when I tell people, when the Bible says put all the whole world, well, God brought them to us. Now here's the point. God says, know who you're fishing for. You've got to know, the more you know about them, the easier it is to reach them. When you've got a target, if you're shooting a gun, the clearer your target, the easier it is to hit them. Hit that target. Now I know what somebody's thinking. I don't have time for this. Demographic study, are you kidding me? Cultural study, geographic study. I don't have time for this. Can you imagine a photographer who goes out and is taking pictures and he goes, I don't have time to focus. Just click, 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 click. I don't have time to focus. I'm just taking pictures. Not even focusing. You don't have any good pictures. Or how about a deer hunter who goes up onto the hillside and shoots into the valley and goes, sure hope I hit something. No, you gotta focus. You gotta know who you're fishing for. Here's the second principle of Jesus. Learn to think like a fish. In fishing for men, you need to learn to think like a fish. It helps to understand their habits and their preferences and their feeding patterns. Certain fish like smooth, still water. And so if you're going to reach those fish, you got to go to smooth, still water. There are other fish like rushing rivers. They want to jump up the rushing rivers. There are some fish who are bottom crawlers, and you're going to use a whole different kind of technique than if those who are hiding under rocks. There's some fish like hide under rocks. You got to know your people. You got to learn to think like a fish. So if you're going to reach unbelievers, you got to understand how they think. This is what made Jesus so effective. Go and study how often in the Bible it says Jesus knew what they were thinking. I've written just some examples there. Matthew 9, Matthew 12, Mark 2, Luke 5, Luke 9, Luke 11. There's at least 5 examples where it says Jesus knew what they were thinking. Well, when you know what people are thinking, it's a whole lot easier to reach them. In Matthew 10, verse 16, Jesus says this, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. What does that verse mean? He says you need to be strategic. And you need to be strategic in your thinking. He says, I want you to be as wise as a serpent and I want you to be harmless as a dove. Usually the church is only half of that verse. We're as harmless as a dove. But we're not always as wise as a serpent. We're not always strategic. And here's the problem, and I want you to write this down. The number one problem in evangelism is this. The longer I am a believer, the less I think like an unbeliever. The longer I am a believer, the less I think like an unbeliever. And the problem with that is that I don't even think like a believer. I think like a pastor. That's 2 generations removed. So I'm going to have to either learn a new way of thinking, or I'm going to have to change what I'm doing. A missionary can pray all he wants and can preach all he wants, but he still has to learn the language. Can you imagine a missionary who moves to Papua New Guinea and has the gospel and has plenty of Bibles and has all the training materials and has the financial backing to support him, but never learns the language? Well, they're not going to reach anybody. You've got to be able to speak their language, and you've got to be able to think like they think. If you're going to reach fish, you've got to think like a fish. I wasn't here about 2 weeks when, prior to starting Saddleback, I had been involved in ministry preaching for 10 years. 10 years. I started preaching when I was 15, and I told you, started trying to help plant a church when I was just a teenager. And by the time I was 20, I preached about 120 crusades in little churches all up down the West Coast. So I was very engrafted in revivalistic preaching. So when I came to start Saddleback, I had enough sermons to last me the first 2 years. Sermons that I preached in traditional churches. I was here about 2 weeks, and all of a sudden I realized that the people that were coming to our church at Laguna Hills High School were not at all like the people I grew up with, which were rural Southern Baptists. and we're not all termed in the terminology of religion and revival and evangelical and Baptist terms and things like that. And I actually went back and looked at 10 years of preaching, all the sermons that I preached over 10 years in traditional churches. And I asked myself, not, is this doctrinally correct? Is it theologically sound? Is it biblical and scriptural? Is it a good exposition of the text? I asked this question: would this sermon make sense to the people who came to Laguna Hills High School last Sunday? The unchurched person. I threw out every sermon I preached in 10 years except 2. Started over. Had to develop a whole new style of communication in order to reach the mindset of the people who happen to live here. So, you can preach the truth, but if you're not saying it in the language they can hear, it isn't the truth to them. You see, a lot of times we tell ourselves that people are resistant to the gospel. People just don't want to hear the gospel. In my town, people aren't interested in hearing the good news. People aren't interested in the gospel. And a lot of times, resistance to the gospel is really just poor communication. It's not that we have a bad message. We got the best message in the world. It's good news. I mean, your past is forgiven, you get a purpose for living, you get a home in heaven. What's going to beat that? It's the best news. It's called the good news. But resistance is often not their resistance, it's our poor communication. Anybody remember CB radios? Anybody remember CB radios? Okay, if you raise your hand, you're really old. And they had their own lingo, 10-4, good buddy, put the pedal to the metal, and all that kind of stuff. Here's the thing, there were different channels. You could be preaching the gospel, but if everybody's on a different channel, they're not hearing it. It may be the truth, but nobody's hearing it because they're communicating on a different wavelength. So, you gotta learn to think like a fish. You gotta know who is in your community, and you gotta know how they think, and you've got to tailor the communication style to those particular people. Now, as I said, the problem is that we don't think the way they do. Colossians 4:5, look on your outline, says, "Be wise in the way that you act toward those who are not believers." Are you strategic? Are you wise in the way you act toward believers? As I said, the problem is the longer I'm a believer, the less I think like an unbeliever. So, stop saying people are closed to the gospel today. Please, just stop saying it. And start saying, how can I get on their wavelength? And there are brand new wavelengths we didn't even have 5 years ago. Pokemon Go wavelength. Candy Crush wavelength. Social media wavelength. There are all kinds of channels out there that God did not create. God did not create the internet for pornography. He created it so we could share the gospel. God did not give us the printing press for pornography. He gave it so we could share the gospel. The first thing printed on the printing press was the Bible. Every time God's message has been put into new technology, we have revival or reformation. And we've just been given a whole new technology in your lifetime, in my lifetime, that nobody had before that, called the internet and social media. Before I started Saddleback, I was told, you can't reach affluent people. It's impossible to reach affluent people. They have all their needs met, so they have no needs, and you just can't reach them. And I would say, who says? They have needs too. The poor have needs, the affluent have needs, and everybody in between have needs. You just got to know what those needs are. You got to learn to think like a fish. Now, how do you do that? How do you learn to discover the mindset of believers? 3 words, write this down. Talk to them. Real hard. Talk to them. Here's the problem. If you're a staff member in a church, you spend all your time with believers. And the longer you spend with believers, the more afraid you become of unbelievers. That's why the longer you're a Christian, the less evangelistically effective you become. You know who are the most effective people evangelism in your church? The brand new believer. Because all their friends are unbelievers. They're not afraid of them. They were their friends yesterday. problem as a church ages. There are people in our church, they're good people, godly people. They've been here 20, 30 years. But they're evangelistic ineffective because after 30 years of being in this church, they have already witnessed to their friends 2,000 times. They've invited their friends to church 32 Christmases in a row. Those who came and became believers. Those who haven't. They're not going to. And they're out of people. Because they're not out there making friends with non-believers. So the longer you're a Christian, the more ineffective you become an evangelist unless you intentionally learn to think like a fish. Now, how do you discover the mindset of unbelievers? You talk to them. Now, I've written this down in your outline. If you don't ask the right questions, you won't get the right answers. If you don't get the right answers, you won't develop the right strategy. And if you don't develop the right strategy, you won't get the right results. Let me go back and tell you the story of the beginnings of Saddleback. I told you that when I was still in Texas, I studied the 100 largest churches in the United States. And I asked a serious question. I was looking for what makes a strong, healthy church. And you know what I discovered after studying the 100 largest churches in the United States? They had nothing in common. I mean, as I told you, they were doing it opposite, different ways. God uses all kinds of churches in all different kinds of ways. But I did find two common denominators in every really healthy church. One was the leadership stays. Longevity. They don't keep changing pastors every few years. A church that gets a new pastor every 3 years is like a family that gets a new daddy every 3 years. Kids are going to be schizophrenic. Who do we trust? If you stay, and as I said, you have integrity, people learn to trust you. They'll follow into hell's squirt guns. Why? Because you were there for them. You were there at their bedside. You were there at their graveside. You were there when there was the marital crisis. You were there when they got sick. And you put in your dues year after year. When you build your life into their lives, then they want to follow your vision. But longevity is one of the things. The faith factor is another. The leaders are not afraid to believe God. But what I did is I got out a map of the whole world. And I put it up on our wall, and we were in this little shack that we were living in Fort Worth. And I said, God, we'll go anywhere in the world if you'll just let us spend our whole life in one place. Longevity is a key factor for a healthy church. So just let me go to one place and stay there. I want people to go, oh, that's just old Pastor Rick. He's been there 30 years. So I began to pray about it. And God shut it down and said, you're going to go to the United States. I told you how disappointed I was in that. I circled every major city outside of the South on this map of the U.S. Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, Albuquerque, Phoenix, Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego, Orange County. I didn't circle the South because I was going to school in the South. I thought, man, there's a church on every corner here. I'll just go where people aren't willing to go. And when we narrowed it down to this area, I remember, okay, that's where we're going to go. I knew nothing about the area. I'd never seen it. And I'm in Texas. And I wrote a letter to Herman Wooten, who was the district superintendent or the director of missions or the area supervisor for Baptist churches in Orange County, because I was going to the Baptist seminary. And I wrote him, dear Mr. Wooten, I'm a young seminary student and I'm thinking about planting a church in Orange County, and I've studied this area called the Saddleback Valley. It sounds interesting. What do you think about the Saddleback Valley? I'm not asking you for money or for support. I just want to know, what do you think about this area? In the providence of God, this man, Herman Wooten, had heard somehow about this young seminary student, was interested in maybe coming to California. And he wrote me a letter. And he said, dear Mr. Warren, I hear you're thinking about planting a church and maybe even coming to California. Have you ever considered a place called the Saddleback Valley? And our letters crossed in the mail. I was like, whoa, this is kind of weird. I put my letter in the mail one day, and the next day I went out to the post office and got his as he was getting mine. I saw the postmark on it, and I opened it up and said, have you considered Saddleback Valley? And I burst into tears. Only God can do that kind of thing. So I thought, okay. So I cut school for a week, And I brought Kay out here, and we came out here to Southern California, went up on a hill, prayed over the area, memorized a bunch of a bunch of road names and parkway names, looked over the area and said, okay, this is where we're going to spend our entire life. I will live and die in one location, God willing. Then once we got here, we moved on January 1, 1980. And we came across Southern California, across from Texas, with a U-Haul truck, being wealthy seminary students. Had about $1,000 to our name, which was to keep us moving. When we got here, we didn't have any money for a rent the first night. In fact, we didn't have enough money for a motel the first time we got here. We literally moved on faith. We were going to just sleep in the truck. We actually ended up going up to Anaheim and spending the night in the pastor's home that night because we didn't even have money for a motel. But I'll never forget coming in on Highway 10 and coming into the San Bernardino Riverside area, and it was jam-packed at rush hour traffic, 8 lanes on either side, and nobody's moving. I don't know why they call the slowest time of the year rush hour of the day, but because nobody's rushing anywhere, it's just jam. And I'm looking here and I'm sitting here. Now, remember, I was raised in a little village of 500 people. And I'm a country boy. And I looked out and I saw 16 lanes of parking lot on the freeway. And I go, God, you got the wrong guy. What in the world am I doing here? And I really had doubts, and we haven't even moved in yet. We got here 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I went in, I found the closest, pulled off El Toro Road, found the closest real estate office I could find, walked in, there was one guy in this real estate office at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. All the realtors had gone home, and his name was Don Dale. I said, Don, my name is Rick Warren. I'm 25 years old. I'm here to start a new church. I don't have any members. I don't have any building. I don't have any salary. I don't have any money. And I need a place to live. He did what you just did. He started laughing. He said, well, let's just see what we can do. Where God guides, God provides. To make a long story short, within 2 hours, he'd shown us a condo, one little tiny apartment. I said, we'll take it. He called up ugly lime green 70s carpet. He called up the owner, got us the first month rent-free and nothing down. He said, I don't know why, because he knew the guy who owned it. He goes, I just trust this guy. He says, I think he's, can be counted on. And so within 2.5 hours, when we were driving over, I said, hey, Don, do you go to church anywhere? He said, no, I don't like church. I said, great, my first member. I said, I'm going to build a church for people who don't like church. He goes, okay. So we got the condo, we walked in, looked at, we'll take it, we signed those papers on it, got the first month rent-free, and that man became the first member of Saddleback Church. First guy I met. He's still a member here, 36 years later. And so we started a week later, Kay and I and our baby daughter, 4-month-old Amy, and Don and his wife and his little girl, and one other person I found. We had 7 people, and that's how Saddleback started. So then I said to these guys, you guys, Trill Obvious, I don't know this area at all. I need to learn to think like these people. I'm not from this area. It's a higher standard of living than I ever grew up with. I grew up in a poor rural area. So I'm going to have to just talk to people. So for the next week, that little group of us, we were about 15 people, and for 12 weeks we went door to door all day talking to people. And I gave everybody a little clipboard, and I said, you go to the door, and these are the questions that you ask. And they're there on your outline. They've been used by several thousands of churches since, but this is the personal opinion poll that I would encourage you to take. You could adapt it and write in your own questions, but I would walk to the door, and the first thing I would say is, hi, my name is Rick Warren, and I'm not here to sell anything. I'm not here to invite you anything. I'm not here to convert you anything. I'm just taking an opinion poll. I've got 5 questions. There are no right or wrong answers, and it'll take about 90 seconds. And I have 90 seconds. Now, by saying that, I just watched the tension drain out, because I'm not trying to invite them even to church. I'm just trying to get their opinion. And I'm only going to take 90 seconds. So here were my questions. Number one, are you currently active in a local church? I didn't say member, because people say, oh yeah, I'm a member of the Catholic Church, or a member of Jehovah's Witness, or whatever. Are you currently active in a local church? If they said yes, I said, God bless you. And I politely excused myself and went to the next home, because I'm not interested in the opinions of Christians. Jesus said, I came for the sick who need the doctor. I wasn't interested in the opinions of Christians. And so when they say, yes, I go to church, God bless you, keep going there. And I wouldn't even ask them the next 4 questions. Thank you. When I find people say, no, I don't go to church, I say, fantastic, that's great. You're just the kind of person I want to ask these questions. Let me ask you 4 questions. And here they were. What do you think is the greatest need in the Saddleback Valley? Now, I wrote all the answers down. Now, a lot of things they said I couldn't do anything about, but it got them talking. You know, taxes are too high, or the roads are too clogged, or the gas prices are too high. I just wrote down whatever they said. What do you think is the biggest need? Then I asked the question, why do you think most people don't attend church? Now, this is a psychologically safe question. I could have said, why don't you go to church? And they said, well, it's none of your business. That's offensive. But if you say, why do you think most people don't go to church? 9 times out of 10, they're going to give you their reason anyway, but it doesn't put them on the defense. Does that make sense? So you just say, why do you think most people don't go to church? And I wrote them all down. Okay? Then the next question was, if you were looking for a church, what kind of things would you look for? And I just wrote those down. You know what I discovered? What most unchurched people were looking for in church was not at all what we were offering. I didn't have one person say, I'm looking for great choir music, accompanied by an organ. Not one. The stuff that they said they were looking for, we weren't even in the same universe as that. And then the last question I asked was, what advice would you give to me? How can I help you? I'm planning on starting a new church to be a benefit to the community. How could I help you? What could I do? How could I serve you? You know what the number 1 answer on that was? I have no idea. Because the average non-believer hasn't a clue how the church could be a benefit to your life, to their life. And so they don't even know. So there's already a gap there. Now when I ask, why don't you think most people go attend church regularly? The 4 biggest reasons, here they were. You might write them down if they're not already down. Maybe you already did them. Yeah. The first one was, sermons are boring and don't relate to my life. Okay? So I thought, okay, whatever I do, I got to say something on Sunday that helps people on Monday morning. Then the second one is that members are unfriendly to attenders. I said, you know, when I go to church, it's like a clique. Everybody knows when to kneel, when to stand up, shout down, sit, or whatever, you know, fight. They said, we don't know all of the lingo, and we don't know what to do. We feel kind of, let me put it this way. Have you ever gone back and walked across your high school campus as an adult and felt how weird it was? When years ago, you were the big person on campus. You felt very comfortable there. But now you feel like everybody's looking at you. That's the way a non-believer feels when they walk into a church. Everybody's looking at me, and I haven't the foggiest idea what to do. I don't know if I'm going to do the right thing or embarrass myself. And members are unfriendly visitors. A lot of churches say, we love people. What they mean is we love the people who are already here. Doesn't mean they love new people. Okay, the third biggest problem is there's too much emphasis on your money. This was a big thing for a lot of non-believers. The church is more interested in your wallet than you. I said, okay, we got to figure out how to lower that barrier and say, okay, if you're a guest, a visitor, please don't give. That's our policy. The fourth one was the children's programs and the child care are weak. We worry about the quality of child care for our children because there are a lot of young couples in this area. Now, I looked at those. Those are the 4 biggest reasons in this area that people said they didn't go to church. None of them are theological issues. They're all sociological issues. None of these, I didn't have a single person tell me I'm an atheist. I'm sure they're out there, but nobody said that to me. Most people, they're not against God, they just don't like church. They find it irrelevant, cliquish, focused on the wrong things, and I don't know if I trust your children, my children, to you. So what we learned is this: most church people, unchurched people, are not atheists. They're just turned off and too busy. They're turned off and they're too busy. But by spending 12 weeks before I even had first service, just listening to people, I began to learn the mindset of this people. This takes time. I know people who want to send out robocalls to do this. People try to do this with emails. It's nothing like you just going and listening to people, having a conversation. If you don't like people, get out of the ministry. Okay? If you don't like people, you shouldn't be serving in a church. If you want to send everybody an email instead of making a phone call, or not showing up on their doorstep, well then, do something else. Now, I took all that information from 12 weeks and I summarized it, and I wrote an open letter to the community. And on the next page, here's the letter. This is how we targeted, how we learned to think like the fish in this area. And this is written March 20, 1980. And we sent this 10 days out before Easter. And it said this: "Hi neighbor, at last a new church for those who've given up on traditional church services." That's called a positioning statement. And right there I'm telling you who we're going after and who we're not. Let's face it, many people aren't active in church these days. Why? Too often, sermons are boring, don't relate to life. Many churches seem more interested in your walk than you. Members are unfitting to visit. I just listed the 4 things they had told me they didn't like. Marketing attacks the objections of the people you're dealing with. Do you think attending church should be enjoyable? Well, we've got good news for you. Saddleback Church is a new church designed to meet your needs in the 1980s. We're a group of friendly people who discovered the joy of the Christian lifestyle at Saddleback. You meet new friends and get to know your neighbors. Enjoy exciting music with contemporary flavor. Hear positive, practical messages which uplift you each week, and trust your children with the care of dedicated nursery workers. I just answered the 4 biggest complaints. Now, friends, that letter right there, we hadn't even had a service yet. That entire thing's written on faith. This is speaking it into existence. Or going way out on them, one or the other. I hadn't even had a service yet when I'm writing this. Why not get a lift instead of let down this Sunday? Invite you to be our guest at our first public celebration, Easter Sunday, Laguna Hills High School. If you don't have a church home, give us a try, discover the difference. All right, that little group of 15 people, we hand-addressed and hand-stamped 15,000 letters. Mailed them out 10 days before Easter. We went $6,000 in debt for that mailing. Sorry. Well, say, how'd you start the church? With our credit cards. I thought I should do a commercial. MasterCard built my church. Priceless. All right. So we mailed this out and invited them to come on Easter. Now, 10 days early. Some people misread this letter and came a week early. We had a trial run service. The week before Easter, I said, I'm going to take the 15 of you down to Laguna Hills High School, and I'm going to preach like there are 50 people here, or 100 people here, or whatever. And like we're just starting out. And so next week, when people show up, it'll look like we know what we're doing. We've had a 1 week of practice. So we went down and we ran to high school a week early for a trial run service, but some people misread this letter, came a week early. And we had 60 people to trial run, and 6 people got saved. I want to say, sorry, no, you got to come back. Nobody can be saved till next week. That's when we officially start. But I did. We let them get saved on that week. So the next week, 205 people show up. I told you a week after that, it dropped about 100, 150, and Saddleback Church was born. It's easier to turn a crowd into a core than a core into a crowd. But we obviously had hit our target. Now, when we got to the service, man, we had hit our mark because everybody there was a non-believer. It was like preaching to a Kiwanis club. I got up and said, everybody, let's sing this song. Nobody knew the songs. Nobody knew the song. Everybody, let's open our Bibles. Nobody had a Bible. not a revivalistic background. I have totally hit the target. Non-believers. By learning to think like an unbeliever. And in the first 10 weeks of Saddleback Church, over 60 people gave their lives to Christ. And we were off, and we were running. And so we built a church on unbelievers. I actually had non-believers helping me plan the first service. In that first little group of 15, I had just met some people. Hey, come on, help me start the church. They weren't even Christians. Terry Jacoby, she and her husband, his husband's named Animal. And they were in charge of the children's ministry. I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding. They weren't Christians, okay? And there were other people, and these people are not believers. It's okay, you're going to take the offering, and you're going to show up at church, and you set up the refreshment table. And I had non-believers. What you start with, it's easier to reach. There was actually a church, very kind church, up in Anaheim, a Southern Baptist church, that offered to send about 40 of their members down to help start Saddleback Church. And I said, thank you, but no. You can send money, but because the kind of people in that church were not the kind of people we were trying to reach. Does that make sense? And a lot of them had Southern accents. And I go, there's plenty of those churches around. So it's learning to think like an unbeliever. And that is how we got started, all right? Now, it's time to break. So we're going to break for lunch, and after lunch,